The stars were quiet, but the war was not. For 3 long years, the galactic conclave had been losing, world after world fell to the Vreth Dominion, a cold, calculating empire of hive mind. Soldiers who did not feel pain, did not feel fear, and did not stop until everything before them was ash. They moved like a tide, slow, unstoppable, and utterly without mercy. The conclave was made up of 17 species. Some had long necks and 4 arms, some breathed methane, some were barely more than soft, floating creatures who had learned to build ships before they learned to walk upright. They were old civilizations, wise ones. They had treaties and councils and long histories of peace, but peace had not prepared them for the Vreth. High Arbiter Essevel stood at the tall window of his command chamber aboard the flagship Undying Accord and looked out at what remained of his fleet, 41 ships. 2 years ago, there had been over 300. The battle at Kareth Station alone had taken nearly 100. The battle at the Dalamer Passage had taken 60 more. Each engagement had been the same. The conclave fought hard, bled deep, and retreated. The Vreth simply advanced. Essevel was Thalassian. His species had long pale blue skin, wide dark eyes that caught light like still water, and 4 slender fingers on each hand. He was old, even by Thalassian standards. He had lived through 2 smaller wars, and had helped write the treaties that ended both. He had always believed that all conflicts could end through reason. That was what the conclave stood for. But the Vreth did not reason, they consumed. He turned from the window and looked at the faces around the long table, his generals, his diplomats, his advisors. All of them wore the same expression. Tired, hollow, afraid. They had run out of good options 3 months ago. Now they were working through the bad ones. "We cannot hold the mare in line," said General Pharaoh, a broad-shouldered Dravathi with gray-green scales and tired eyes. "If we pull back to the secondary position, we lose the shipyards. If we lose the shipyards, we cannot repair what we have. Within 6 months, we will have no fleet at all." Nobody disagreed. Nobody had a better answer. Essevel sat down slowly at the head of the table. He folded his hands in front of him and stared at the surface for a long moment. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the ship's engines. "Then we ask for help," he said. One of the younger advisors, a Filari named Quietus, looked up, "From whom?" "Every species within range either cannot fight or has already refused. The Orvani declared neutrality. The Hikari do not have the ships. The Breath Collective offered supplies but nothing more." "Not from them," Essevel said. He reached across the table and pulled up a star map on the central display. A small yellow star blinked near the edge of the known galaxy. A single inhabited world orbited it, a small blue-green planet wrapped in white clouds. From them, the room went quiet in a different way. A few people shifted in their seats. Quietus looked at the star and frowned. "The humans, Arbiter, they are not even a formal member of the conclave. They only joined the outer observation agreement 4 years ago. Their technology is sufficient," Essevel said, "and they are the only ones who have not yet said no." Pharaoh leaned forward. "We haven't asked them yet." "No," Essevel agreed, "we haven't." He looked around the table once more, meeting every pair of eyes. "But we will. Now we are past the point of choosing good options, General. We are choosing Between survival and defeat, I will take survival in whatever shape it comes. He composed the message himself. He did not leave it to diplomats or scribes. He sat alone in his private chamber for 2 hours and wrote it by hand, then had it translated and broadcast across every open frequency, not just toward Earth, but outward in all directions to every corner of map space. It was a simple message. It said that the conclave was fighting for its life, that 17 civilizations and hundreds of billions of people were on the edge of being erased, that they were asking any neutral species, any people with the will and ability to answer. He did not demand, he did not promise great rewards. He simply said, we are here, we are losing, and we are asking. Then he waited. Responses came in over the next several days. The Orvani sent condolences to small species closer to the edge of the galaxy, sent offers of food and medical supplies. One ancient civilization sent a long philosophical message about the nature of war that was, in practical terms, completely useless. A few species did not respond at all. Then on the 5th day, a signal came back from the direction of the small yellow star. It was delayed. The distance alone accounted for that, crackly with static, compressed to fit across the vast empty stretch between their position and Earth. The voice on the recording was a woman's. She spoke in a flat, calm tone, as if she were reporting weather conditions rather than answering a desperate call for help across the galaxy. This is Admiral Yara Akanwo, United Earth Expeditionary Command. We received your transmission. We're already on our way. Estimated arrival at the Kareth Nebula staging point, 42 standard days. Don't move your fleet without telling us first. Akanwo out. That was it. No questions, no negotiations, no requests for resource payments or territorial agreements. They had heard the call and they were coming. For a moment, the bridge was completely silent. Then Quietus quietly pulled up the conclave's xenobiological records on humanity. The file was not long. Humans had only been in contact with the wider galaxy for a little over 30 years. They were a young species, technologically speaking. Their ships were slower than average. Their weapons were functional, but not advanced. On paper, they were an unremarkable civilization from a small world near the outer arm of their galaxy. And then Quietus scrolled to the planetary classification. He read it twice. Then he read it a third time slowly. Earth Solar System, classification D88. WRLD Class 5. He read the details beneath it. Gravity was nearly 10 ms squared, far heavier than the Thalassian homeworld, heavier than almost anything in the conclave's territory. The atmosphere was a volatile mix of nitrogen and oxygen, a combination that could sustain fire under the right conditions, meaning the planet's own air was capable of burning. The surface temperature ranged across more than 60 degrees depending on season and location. The oceans covered most of the planet and reached crushing depths. The land masses were filled with creatures large enough to kill armored soldier. Their snorts were diseases, parasites, extreme weather events, seismic activity, volcanic zones. And the humans, the dominant species, had not just survived all of it, they had risen to the top of that world's entire food chain. They had fought their way to the top over millions of years, against everything their planet had thrown at them. Quietus set the report down on the table, very carefully, the way someone sets down a glass they are afraid of breaking. Arbiter, he said slowly, I think we need to talk about what exactly we just invited. As Savo looked at the report, he read it. In silence, when he finished, he folded his hands again and stared at the middle distance for a long moment. We asked for warriors, he said at last. Yes, Quietus said. And warriors are coming. Quietus nodded carefully. That appears to be the case. As Savo looked back out at the stars, 42 days. The Marin line would hold for 42 days if they were careful and lucky. Maybe 50 if they were brilliant, he thought about the Vreth grinding forward through space, world by world, patient and pitiless as a tide. He thought about his people, about every world in the conclave, about all the billions of lives that depended on what happened next. Then he thought about a small blue-green world in the outer arm of the galaxy, world that had spent millions of years trying to kill its own children, and the calm, flat voice of a woman who had answered a desperate cry for help with the words, we're already on our way. Make sure the docking bay is ready. As Savo said quietly, and brief, our soldiers on human, and I don't want any misunderstandings when they arrive. Far out cleared his throat. What kind of misunderstandings are we expecting? As Savo was quiet for a moment, he looked at the classification again. Class 5. Deathworld, top of the food chain. I don't know, he admitted. That's what worries me. Far across the empty dark, 42 light days away, a fleet of human ships burned hard through space toward the Karath Nebula. Their hulls were scarred, their crews were awake and ready. And at the front of the formation, on the bridge of the heavy carrier UES Endurance, Admiral Yara Akanwo stood, with her hands clasped behind her back, and looked at the stars ahead. She did not look worried. She looked like a person who had a job to do and fully intended to do it. The Karath Nebula was a vast cloud of red and purple gas that drifted between 4 star systems like a slow-burning bruise. It had no habitable planets, no resources worth harvesting. It was too thick for most sensors to see through clearly, which made it nearly invisible from a tactical standpoint, and that was exactly why the Conclave had chosen it. As a staging ground, you could hide a fleet inside it, you could breathe for a moment, you could plan. The Conclave's 41 remaining ships floated in the red dark and waited. Asaval had not slept well in the 42 days. Since sending the message, he had kept himself busy with reports, with troop movements, with the endless paperwork that came with managing a war. But every morning he woke early and sat in the quiet of his chamber and thought about what was coming. He told himself he was calm. He was not entirely sure he believed it. On the 42nd day, the sensors lit up. The human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the nebula and the Conclave's bridge. Crew watched the arrivals on their screens in a long silence. One ship appeared, then another, then another. They came in steadily, not all at once, spacing themselves out in careful formation as they decelerated into the red cloud. Quietus was counting quietly. He reached 30 before he stopped, then more came. By the end, there were 61 human vessels sitting in the Karath Nebula, and the Conclave's analysts were staring at them with open confusion. The ships were not what anyone had expected. They were large, some of them very large, and there was a kind of brutish, functional solidity to them that made conclave ships look almost delicate by comparison, but they were not beautiful. They were not sleek or elegant. Their hulls were covered in mismatched panels of plating, clearly replaced and welded. At different times, long scorch marks ran along several of the larger vessels, the kind of marks left by atmospheric re-entry or close weapons fire. One ship near the back of the formation had an entire engine pod that was clearly newer than the rest of the hull, as if it had been ripped off and replaced sometime in the recent past. The whole fleet looked like it had been in several bad situations and had come out of all of them through sheer stubbornness rather than grace. Their ships, Farrell said slowly, standing beside SciFiStories on the observation deck, look like they have been repaired many times. Yes, SciFiStories said. And they kept the ships anyway. Yes. Farrell was quiet for a moment. We usually retire a ship when it takes that level of damage. I noticed a communication request came in from the lead vessel, the *UE's Endurance. A massive carrier-class ship that was nearly twice the length of the Undying Accord. SciFiStories accepted it and found himself looking at a human face for the first time in person rather than through a recorded message. Admiral Yara Akinquo was a dark-skinned woman with short gray hair and calm brown eyes. She wore a uniform that was plain and functional, with no decoration, except for the rank markings on her collar. She sat very still in her command chair, not the careful stillness of someone suppressing emotion, but the natural, comfortable stillness of someone who simply did not move unless they needed to. She looked at SciFiStories the way someone looks at a person they are meeting for the first time but fully intend to work with. Arbiter SciFiStories, she said, I'm Admiral Akinquo. Thank you for holding the line until we got here. SciFiStories, who was 400 years old and had met dozens of alien species, found himself momentarily caught off guard by the simple directness of it. Thank you for coming, Admiral. We did not expect such a swift response. You said it was urgent, she said, as if that explained everything. We'd like to begin coordinating as soon as possible. My senior staff can be aboard your ship within the hour if you're ready for us. Of course, SciFiStories said, we will prepare. When the human shuttle docked and the boarding ramp came down, SciFiStories was there to meet them personally, with Farrell at his side and a small honor guard of Thalessian soldiers behind him. He had read the briefing about human customs. He knew they greeted each other by gripping hands and moving them up and down. He had practiced the motion. But when the humans walked out, he found his attention pulled away from customs entirely. There were 8 of them, Akinquo and her senior officers. They were shorter than Esau had expected from the records, most of them around the height of a young Thalassian with heavier builds than his own slender people. They were bilaterally symmetrical, 2 arms and 2 legs, 1 head, just as the file said. They looked on the surface like a fairly unremarkable species, but there was something about the way they moved. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't threatening, it was simply very present. Each step was placed with a kind of relaxed certainty, like every human in the group had long ago made peace with the fact that the ground would hold Their eyes moved constantly, quickly taking in the bay and the soldiers and the ship in the way that something accustomed to watching for danger scans a new environment, not with fear but with habit, with a reflex. Far Out noticed it too. He leaned slightly toward Esau and said very quietly, "They walk like predators." "They are predators," Esau murmured. "Back, their species hunted for food on their home world for most of their evolutionary history." "I know," Far Out said. "I just didn't think it would be this obvious." Akin Quo extended her hand. Esau gripped it and moved it up and down. The Admiral smiled slightly, a small genuine expression, and did not make any issue of the fact that his grip was half the strength of hers. The briefing began an hour later in the war room. Esau had expected it to take most of the day. Akin Quo had her staff present a full analysis of the current situation in under 30 minutes, then laid out her proposed battle plan in the following 4. The room went very quiet. The plan was aggressive in a way that made Conclave military doctrine look like a polite suggestion. It called for simultaneous strikes on 3 Wraith positions spread across 2 star systems, using speed and confusion to prevent the hive mind from coordinating an effective response. It relied on human troops hitting the ground in what their military called drop pod insertions, small armored capsules fired directly through planetary atmospheres while enemy anti-air defenses were still active. Farrell stared at the holographic display for a moment. "You are proposing to drop your soldiers through live fire. It's faster than waiting for the air defense to go down," Akin Quo said. "They will be shooting at your soldiers on the way in." "Yes, in small metal capsules. The pods are well armored." "How well?" One of Akin Quo's officers, a broad, quiet man named Major Darrow, answered, without looking up from his data pad. "Enough, usually." Farrell turned to look at Esavo with an expression that intelligent body language meant approximately, "Are you hearing this?" Esavo did not respond. He was watching Akin Quo. She was not performing confidence. She was not trying to impress them. She simply presented the plan the way person presents a thing they have thought through carefully and decided is correct. There was no bluster in it, no drama, just calm certainty. "Walk me through the logic," Esavo said. She did, and as she talked it began to make a kind of brutal, efficient sense. The Wraith hive mind was very good at coordinated responses to expected threats. It was slower when faced with multiple simultaneous crises happening in different places. The plan was designed not to win through superior force. The Conclave didn't have enough ships for that, but to create so much chaos across so many points that the hive mind couldn't process fast enough to contain it. "You're not planning to overpower them," Asaval said slowly. "No," Akin Quo agreed. "We're planning to confuse them. There's a difference." That evening, as the human officers were taken to their assigned quarters, Asaval found himself standing with the Conclave medical officer, a gentle Falari named Thovin, who had been asked to run a routine health check on the arriving troops. Thovin found Asaval in the corridor and pulled him aside with a slightly stunned expression. "Arbiter," Thovin said, "I finished the basic health scans." And Thovin handed him the data pad. "First soldier I scanned, a female, mid-career based on her rank markings, showed 14 healed bone fractures. Evidence of 3 separate serious infections that had been treated and recovered from surgical scarring on her side and left arm, and what appears to be a regenerated section of tissue on her right knee. He paused. She told me this was normal. When I asked if she had lived through a particularly dangerous career, she said she had spent most of her service in administrative logistics. SciFiStories looked at the scan. He looked at Thoven, administrative logistics. Yes, arbiter, desk work essentially. Thoven shook his head slowly. I checked 3 more soldiers after that, all similar results. These are not the battle scars of frontline fighters. This appears to be just what happens to humans who exist. SciFiStories handed the data pad back. He stood in the corridor for a long moment, listening to the sounds of the human fleet somewhere outside the hull. Distant communications, the noise of machinery, the faint sound of laughter from somewhere down the docking corridor. Laughter, they were laughing. He thought about the Class 5 designation again. He thought about the scorch marks on their ships, the calm in Akinquo's voice, the way their soldiers moved through the bay like animals that had never in their entire evolutionary history learned to be prey. Then he thought about the Vreth, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt something other than despair. He felt something that might cautiously be called hope. Kalos IV was a gray, cold planet. Its sky was the color of old metal, covered in low clouds that never fully broke open. Its surface was mostly flat tundra, broken up by shallow ridges and long stretches of dark rock. The Vreth had taken it 8 months ago, not because it had great resources, but because it sat at a junction between 3 important conclave supply routes. Control Kalos IV and you strangled those routes. Lose it and you gave up a critical vein. The conclave had tried to retake it twice. Both times they had been pushed back with heavy losses. Akinquo studied the planet's surface maps for 2 days before she presented her plan. She divided the operation into 3 stages. The first was orbital. Human and conclave ships would engage the Vreth defensive fleet above the planet and pull their attention skyward. The second was the drop. 3 companies of human ground troops would hit the surface in pods while the orbital fight was still hot, using the chaos above to mask their entry. The third was the push. Once on the ground, the human's clear's throat would move on the central command node that controlled the Vreth's planetary defense grid, destroy that, and the Vreth forces on the surface would lose coordination. After that, conclave ground forces would land and sweep the planet clean. Pharaoh had reviewed the plan twice and still looked deeply unhappy about the drop pod phase. If the orbital engagement goes badly, he said, your troops on the surface will have no air support and no extraction. Then we won't let the orbital engagement go badly, Akinquo said. And if it does anyway? She looked at him steadily. Then my people on the ground will handle the situation until we fix it. Pharaoh said nothing more. There was something about the way she said it, not recklessly, not as a boast, but as a plain and simple statement of what would happen, that made further argument feel beside the point. The operation began at 300 by ship time in the deep cold of what passed for night on Kalos IV. The human fleet hit the Vreth defense ships first, coming in fast and low at an angle that forced the Vreth to choose between protecting their orbital stations or engaging the incoming ships. Directly, the Vreth chose to split their response, which was exactly what Alconquo had predicted they would do. While half the Vreth fleet turned to deal with the attacking ships, the other half tried to cover the stations, and in the gap between those two priorities, 48 drop pods punched through the upper atmosphere on the bridge of the Endurance. Esavo watched the orbital battle unfold beside Admiral Alconquo. He had asked to observe, she had agreed. Without hesitation. The fighting in orbit was brutal and very fast. Human ships moved differently than Conclave ships. They pushed harder into turns, used their engines in short, violent bursts rather than steady. Thrust seemed to accept more damage in exchange for better position. One of the smaller human escort ships took a direct hit to its forward section and kept flying, kept fighting. That ship, Esavo said, pointing to the damaged escort on the display, they should withdraw. Alconquo glanced at the reading. They're still combat capable, 80%. They have hull breaches in 2 sections. The crew sections are intact. She watched the ship for another second. It rolled hard and fired twice, destroying a Wraith fighter. They're fine. Down on the surface of Callus IV, the pods hit the ground like hammers. The landing zone was a long, flat stretch of rock about 12 km from the Wraith command node, chosen because it was outside the immediate sensor range of the defensive grid. The pods were designed to absorb impact, but absorb was a relative term. The soldiers inside hit the ground at a speed that would have broken most species and came out of the hatches 30 seconds later, moving at a run. Sergeant Myra Tunn led the first squad. Out, the air outside was thin and bitter. Cold, the temperature well below freezing. She was wearing a sealed combat suit, but she could feel the cold. Anyway, a faint pressure against the suit's joints. She ran her eyes across the landscape and listened. Wraith patrols would be responding in minutes. The element of surprise would last exactly as long as it took for the first sensors to register the pod impacts. Move, she said, and her squad moved. They covered 12 km of uneven terrain in just under 90 minutes through wind and rock and 2 stretches of soft freezing mud that came up past the knee. They did not stop. They did not complain. One soldier twisted his ankle badly in a rock crevice about 4 km in. He tightened the brace on his suit, adjusted his weight, and kept moving. He was limping badly for the last 8 km. He did not mention it. The Vreth patrol found them at the 7 km mark. 8 Vreth soldiers came over a ridge in close formation, moving with the precise synchronized motion of hive coordinated troops. They were larger than humans, roughly 2 and 1.2 m tall, with hard-plated exoskeletons and 4 upper limbs, 2 used for movement and 2 for weapons. They had no individual names. They were designated units in a larger mind. They saw the humans. The humans saw them. And the humans opened fire first. The Vreth patrol was eliminated in 40 seconds. 1 human soldier took a glancing shot to the left arm that cut through the suit and left a burn. He wrapped it quickly with a pressure seal and kept moving without breaking stride. The squad did not slow down. What came next was not a clean, controlled advance. It was messy, loud, and violent in the way that human combat had always been, ugly and effective and thoroughly uninterested in aesthetics. The Vreth began redirecting units toward the intruders once their sensors picked up the patrol's destruction. More soldiers came. The humans met, each one the same way. Fast, direct, pushing forward using terrain and darkness and their own physical endurance to keep the Vreth constantly reacting instead of acting. A second squad, led by Lieutenant Orion Vass, ran into a much larger Vreth unit. 30 soldiers blocking the route to the command node. By Conclave tactical doctrine, the correct response to this was to pull back, request support, wait for reinforcement, and form a new approach plan. Vass called it into command as required. Then his squad charged directly into the 30 Vreth soldiers. They fought through them in 7 minutes. 3 humans were wounded, non-critically. All 3 kept fighting. When command asked if they needed extraction, Vass sent back a single word negative. Then he asked if more ammunition could be dropped. He was told it would take 20 minutes. He acknowledged it and said they would manage until then. Inside the Vreth command structure, something was happening that had never happened before in 63 conquered species. Reports were coming in faster than the hive mind's local coordination could process them. The patrols weren't just being defeated, they were being overwhelmed quickly by a much smaller force that showed no sign of slowing down. The hive mind began redirecting more and more units. It pulled soldiers from the northern defensive perimeter. It called for reinforcements from the eastern settlement garrison. This was, of course, exactly what Akanwo had planned, because while the Vreth were sending every available soldier toward tons and vast squads, the 3rd squad, 12 soldiers moving in total silence along a dry riverbed the Vreth had assessed as impassable, was within 200 m of the command node. Corporal Sierra Den was leading the 3rd squad. She was 26 years old and had grown up in a city on Earth's southern continent. She had joined the military at 18 because it had seemed like a good idea at the time and had simply never found a reason to stop. She was not thinking about history or the fate of galactic civilizations. She was thinking about the sensor layout she had memorized and the best angle to breach the command node's outer wall. The breach took 4 minutes. The fight inside took 11. The Vreth soldiers within the node fought hard. They always did, but they had been designed for organized, coordinated defense, and the humans inside the node were giving them no space to coordinate. Every time the Vreth tried to form a defensive line, the humans moved sideways, split apart, hit from 2 directions, refused to stand still and be fought the way the hive mind expected. The command node went dark at 6:11. In orbit, the Vreth defense ships began losing coordination almost immediately. Their formation broke into individual responses, and individual responses were much easier to deal with. The human and conclave orbital forces pushed hard through the gap. The battle in space lasted another hour and 40 minutes before the last Vreth ship either broke off or was destroyed. On the bridge of the Asterisk Endurance, SciFiStories watched the final ship run. Akanwo was already on the communication channel with her ground commanders, getting status reports. She was calm and direct and efficient, the same as she had been during the entire fight. She asked about casualties first, then positions, then supply needs. She wrote notes on a small data pad while She talked. 17 wounded, she reported to SciFi. When she was done, no dead. SciFi looked at her, none. None, she paused. It was a good operation. SciFi looked back at the planet below. Carlos IV, gray and cold back in conclave hands. Then he looked at the tactical replay of the ground engagement which his own analysis team had pulled up while the fighting was still happening. He watched the movement of those small groups of humans across 12 km of hostile terrain through the cold, through contact after contact, pushing constantly forward without stopping. In 63 conquered species, the Vreth had faced nothing like this. Somewhere deep in the hive minds, distributed intelligence in a way that hive minds were not supposed to experience, something stirred that had no clear label in its lexicon. It tried to identify the sensation. It searched through its categories: tactical assessment, threat evaluation, enemy profiling. None of them quite fit. It was, though no Vreth unit would ever admit it in those words, something very close to unease. Warmaster Kethra had never lost a planet before. In 40 years of service to the Vreth Dominion, he had commanded the conquest of 11 worlds and the suppression of 4 uprisings. He had taken cold worlds and hot ones, worlds with thick atmospheres, and worlds with none at all. He had faced species that fought cleverly and species that fought desperately, and he had overcome all of them because the hive mind was patient and relentless and did not make the kind of mistakes that individual thinking beings made. But in the 6 weeks since the humans arrived, the Dominion had lost Carlos IV, the Marin orbital station, and 2 of the 3 supply depots in the outer conclave sector. Every time the pattern was the same. The human forces appeared where they were not expected. They fought in ways that defied logical prediction. They did not retreat when retreat was the sensible choice. They did not stop when stopping was the only reasonable option. They simply kept going and kept going and kept going until the Vreth forces they were fighting were no longer capable of stopping them. Kethra stood in the center of his command ship and looked at the tactical display with an expression that his aides had never seen on his face before. He was a large being. All Vreth Warmasters were selected for size as well as tactical ability, a physical reminder of the Dominion's strength, and his plated gray face was usually perfectly still, controlled. He had a reputation for calmness that bordered on indifference. It had served him well. Now his aides watched him and said nothing, because something in the Warmaster's face was not quite as still as usual. "Show me the Marin station engagement." Again, he said. The holographic display ran the battle replay for the 3rd time that morning. Kethra watched the human ships punch into the station's defensive screen at an angle his tactical AI had assessed as nearly suicidal. Watch them take damage that should have broken their formation. Watch them keep fighting anyway, keep pushing, keep closing the distance until they were inside the Vreth defensive perimeter, and the range advantage of the station's long-range weapons became irrelevant. What was the human casualty count in this engagement, he asked. His intelligence officer, a smaller Vreth named Sesak, checked the data. Approximately 30% of their attacking force, the station fell regardless. 30% casualties, and they still took the objective. Yes, Warmaster. Kethra turned from the display. He walked slowly to the wide viewport at the back of his command deck and looked out at the stars. The hive mind murmured. At the edges of his consciousness, the soft, constant presence of thousands of connected soldiers and officers, all sharing information, all coordinated. It was the Dominion's greatest strength. It was why they had never lost. Sesak, he said, what do we know about the human homeworld? Sesak processed the request and pulled the file. Minimal information. We did not consider them a significant threat prior to their arrival in this conflict. What we have is, he paused reading. Arbiter, their planet is classified at the highest death world category in the known galaxy, gravity nearly double the Vreth standard, wildly unstable climate system, extremely diverse and dangerous native fauna. The species itself is he stopped reading and stood still for a moment. Continue, Kethra said. The species evolved as pursuit predators, Sesak said. They are biologically designed to chase prey over long distances until exhaustion. They have an unusually high pain tolerance for carbon-based life. Their bone and muscle density exceeds what is typical for their size. They experience a neurological response to high stress situations, a chemical reaction that in some individuals actually improves performance under extreme physical danger rather than degrading it. He set down the file. Warmester, the phrase their own scientists have used to describe this response is fight or flight. The relevant detail is that a statistically significant number of their population, in the presence of extreme danger, chooses to fight. Kethra was quiet for a long time. He thought about the 30% casualty rate at Marin Station and the fact that the surviving 70% had kept attacking. He thought about the reports from Carlos IV, small groups of humans moving through freezing terrain toward overwhelming opposition and speeding up when they should have slowed down. He thought about the words in every field report his commanders had sent over the past 6 weeks, the phrase that appeared again and again with a kind of helpless repetition. They don't stop. He had dismissed it the first time as the complaint of an embarrassed commander making excuses. He had noted it the second time. By the 6th and 7th time he had begun to wonder if it was something else entirely. I want to know their history, he said. All of it, everything we can access. The research took 3 days. Kethra read it himself rather than delegating, an unusual choice for a War Master and one that his aides noticed but did not comment on. He sat in his private chamber and worked through the files that the Dominion's intelligence services had compiled from conclave databases, human public records, and intercepted communications. He learned about the ice ages, periods in Earth's history where the planet's temperature had dropped dramatically, killing much of the life on its surface. The humans' ancestors had survived by adapting, moving, finding ways to generate warmth in a world that wanted them dead. He learned about the great famines, the plagues, the natural disasters. He learned that the planet had, at various points in human history, been struck by objects from space large enough to reshape entire continents. The humans were still there. He read about human wars, the ones they had fought against each other before they ever reached space. He found this section of the file deeply strange. Most conquered species had histories of Internal conflict, but nothing like this. Humans had waged wars for territory, for resources, for ideology, for religion, for pure spite. They had developed weapons of mass destruction capable of rendering their own world uninhabitable, and had chosen, eventually, not to use them. But the fact that they had built them at all said something. They had on multiple occasions sent soldiers to walk directly into almost certain death because a piece of terrain or an objective was important enough to be worth it. He read about something called a bayonet charge. He read it twice. He read about explorers who had walked into places on their own world. Nothing had ever survived simply because they wanted to see what was there. Some of them had died. The ones who came back had gone again. He put down the files at the end of the third day and sat in silence for a long time. Then he sent a communication request. Not to his fleet commanders, not to the Dominion's High Council, directly to the human flagship. The response came within 20 minutes. Admiral Akonkwu appeared on his screen. She looked at him with the same calm, direct attention she apparently gave everything. War Master, she said. Admiral, he said, I requested this communication privately. What I say here is not a formal negotiation. I am speaking as one commander to another. She nodded once. Go ahead. He took a moment to order his thoughts. He had prepared what he wanted to say. But now that he was saying it, it felt more complicated than he had planned. I have been studying your species, he said, your history, your biology. I have been trying to understand why your forces behave as they do in combat. And I find that I cannot predict you, he said. The hive mind is very effective at predicting patterns. Every species we have encountered follows patterns under pressure. You do not. He paused. I want to understand, not tactically. I mean, I want to understand the thing that makes your soldiers walk into certain death without slowing down. Every species I have ever fought has valued its own survival above all other things. That is what survival means. That is the fundamental drive of all life. He looked at her directly. Your soldiers do not appear to value survival above all things. I need to understand. Why? Because I cannot fight what I cannot understand. Akinkwora was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone thinking of a tactical answer, the quiet of someone considering a genuine question. It's because there are things we value more, she said at last. What things? The people behind us, she said simply. The ones we're fighting for. When your soldiers are moving toward my troops aren't thinking about whether they'll survive the next 5 minutes. They're thinking about the people who won't survive at all if they don't hold the line. She was quiet for a second. Survival is important, but it's not the only thing that's important. For us, it never has been. Keithra sat with that answer for a long time. After the communication ended, he turned it over in his mind, examined it from different angles. He was part of the hive mind. He had never in his life been alone. He had never made a single decision that was entirely his own. Dominion was the sum of all its units, and individual units did not matter, except in service to the whole. And yet, he thought about the human soldiers who had walked across 12 km of frozen ground in the dark to save a planet they had never been to, for people they had never met. He thought about something else too, something smaller, something he had not expected to be in the intelligence files. at all. In the last week of reports from the outer conclave sector, 3 separate intelligence officers had noted the same thing on 2 of the worlds that human forces had helped liberate. The humans had stayed after the fighting was over. They had helped repair buildings, they had distributed food, some of them had played with the alien children in the wreckage of a settlement, chasing them through the ruins and making sounds that the field reports described as asterisk laughter. They had bled to take those worlds, they had lost people, and then they had stayed to help put the broken pieces back together. Kithra looked at the stars outside his viewport for a long time that night. The hive mind murmured steadily around him, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he was thinking a thought that was entirely his own. He was not sure yet what the thought was, but it was there, small and new and very strange, like a crack in a wall that had always been solid. Nobody expected the war to end the way it did. The Conclave's generals had been preparing for a long final campaign into Vrethcore space, months of hard fighting across heavily defended systems, building toward what they assumed would be a bloody and decisive battle at the Dominion's home world. They had drawn up plans, they had moved ships into position, they had briefed their troops on what to expect and told them it would be the hardest fighting of the war. Then War Master Kithra sent a message. It came through on a private channel, encoded in a format that Conclave communications officers took 3 hours to fully decrypt. When they did, they brought it directly to SciFiStories, and SciFiStories read it twice slowly and then called Akinquo. She read it once, she set it down, she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. He wants to meet, she said. Yes, SciFiStories said. Just the 2 of us, him and me, neutral ground, no weapons. That is what he's asking. Akinquo looked at the message again. He says he's speaking for himself, not for the Dominion. Yes. She thought about it for a moment, then she said, all right. SciFiStories had not expected that answer quite so quickly. You trust this? She considered the question seriously. No, she said, but I think it's real. There's something in the way he wrote it. She tapped the data pad with one finger. He used the word asterisk. Understand 4 times, that's not tactical language, that's a person trying to figure something out. The meeting was arranged on a small, empty station at the edge of unclaimed space, a neutral platform that both sides had used for supply transfers early in the war, and neither had any strategic reason to fight over now. Akinquo went alone, as agreed, in a small shuttle. Her crew was not happy about this. Her first officer expressed his displeasure quietly but very thoroughly. She thanked him for his concern, told him she would be back in 3 hours, and left. Kithra was already there when she arrived. He was larger than she had expected from the screen, nearly 2.12 m broad across the shoulders, with a dense, armored build that Vreth Warmasters were bred for over generations. He stood in the center of the station's main room, which was empty except for 2 chairs that someone had placed facing each other. He had, as promised, no weapons. Neither did she. They looked at each other for a moment across the empty room. Then Kethra crossed to one of the chairs and sat down. It was a strangely ordinary gesture somehow. To the other chair and sat down. Thank you for coming, he said. Thank you for asking, she said. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, I have been thinking for many weeks about something I cannot resolve. I have fought 63 species, every one of them, when the pressure became great enough, offered to negotiate. Some fought harder than others, some fought cleverly, but all of them eventually looked at their own survival and decided it mattered more than continuing. He looked at her carefully. Your forces have been taking 30% casualties in some engagements more, and they don't stop. I have been trying to understand the military logic of this. There isn't one, she said simply. He was quiet. It's not a military calculation, she said. It's not strategy. My soldiers fight the way they fight because they mean it, because they know who they're protecting, and they've decided that matters. You can't model that with a tactical AI because it's not a tactical phenomenon. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, I read your history, the wars. Your people fought against each other. The suffering. He paused. You nearly destroyed yourselves many times. Yes. And yet you came here for people you had never met, species you had known for less than 30 years. You came when they called. Yes. He was quiet for a long time. Outside the small station's viewport, the stars were bright and very still. The hive mind does not want to continue this war, he said finally. The losses over the past 6 weeks have been significant. The calculation shifts. The Dominion's purpose is expansion, not destruction. The consumption of productive worlds, a prolonged war of attrition against a species that does not respond to attrition the way other species do. As he stopped. But that is not why I am here. She waited. I am here, he said slowly, as if choosing each word with care, because I read about your people, and I looked at what my people have done to 63 others. And for the first time I found myself capable of imagining it from the other side. He looked at her directly. I do not think the hive mind fully understands what it is doing to the species it conquers, not in the way I am beginning to understand it. The hive considers consumption efficient, logical. I am no longer sure I agree. The silence stretched out for a moment. I can't make peace for the conclave, Akinquo said. That's not my decision. I know, but it is mine for the Dominion. If I return to the High Council and tell them I am choosing to end this war, they will listen. The War Master's word carries weight. He paused. I am asking you if the conclave would accept a withdrawal, a return of the conquered territories, a ceasefire that holds. I can't answer for them, she said again, but I can tell them you asked. She extended her hand. He looked at it for a moment. He had read about this gesture. He extended his claw carefully, and she gripped it, and they held on for a moment in the quiet of the empty station. The ceasefire was announced 4 days later. The conclave erupted. There were celebrations on every free world, lights and music and crowds in the streets. Species that had been afraid for 3 years suddenly released from that fear. The news moved across the galaxy in waves, and everywhere it landed, people stopped what they were doing and felt the shape of the thing that had just changed. SciFiStories sent a formal invitation to Earth requesting that humanity accept a permanent seat on the High Council of the Conclave. He attached a separate message offering resource rights, territorial recognition, and a list of other honors that represented collectively more than most species received in a century. of Alliance membership. Okonkwo's response was polite and warm and declined most of it. Earth didn't need the territory. Earth didn't need the resource rights. The seat on the High Council she accepted, because that was a place to be useful, a place to know what was happening and offer help when it was needed. But the rest of it, the tribute and the rewards, and the grand formal gestures of gratitude, she gently but clearly pushed aside. We came because you asked, she wrote. To SciFiStories, you don't owe us for that. You just owe us a good faith effort to do right by each other going forward. SciFiStories read that message sitting alone in his chamber on the *undying accord. He read it 3 times, then he set the data pad down and sat for a while with a feeling he couldn't quite name. Something warm and steady, like the memory of a thing he had doubted for a long time finally turning out to be true. He had believed once that all conflicts could end through reason. The war had shaken that belief badly, but looking at what had just happened at the ceasefire, at the freed worlds, at the strange new shape of things, he wondered if he had been thinking about it wrong. Not reason alone, reason and together, reason and the willingness to walk into the worst possible situation and keep going anyway because the people on the other side of it deserve the effort. The human fleet began its departure from Conclave space 3 weeks after the ceasefire. They left quietly without fanfare, ships peeling off in small groups toward their jump points and disappearing into FTL one by one. There were no grand ceremonies. Okonkwo had declined those too. On one of the liberated worlds, a small Thalian colony called Vithsara that had been under Vreth occupation for almost 2 years, a young soldier named Erden had spent the last several weeks working alongside a human squad as a liaison officer. He was 23 years old and had spent most of the war terrified, which he had done his best to hide. He had watched the humans fight on Vithsara's surface and had felt, for the first time in 3 years, like he was standing behind something that could not be knocked over. He was at the spaceport when the last human shuttle lifted off. He watched it rise through the pale blue sky until it was just a point of light, and then nothing. Behind him, the colony was still. Damaged buildings with holes in them. Streets not yet repaired, the marks of occupation everywhere. But people were out in those streets. They were talking, working, a group of children chasing each other through an open square with the particular joy of children who have been afraid for a long time and are finally, cautiously not afraid anymore. One of the human soldiers, a stocky sergeant named Hale, whom Erden had worked with for 3 weeks, had spent her last day on Vithsara helping a group of colonists clear rubble from a collapsed building. She had worked alongside them for 6 hours, ate her lunch sitting on a broken wall and sharing something from her ration pack with a curious Thalian child who had wandered over to investigate the strange creature eating in the ruins. Erden had watched this and hadn't known what to say. He had asked her late in the day why she was doing it. There was no military objective in clearing rubble. Sergeant Hale had looked at him with mild surprise, as if the answer were obvious. Because it needs doing, she said, and we're here. He thought about that now, watching the sky where the shuttle had been. He thought about the months of fighting, the losses, the long gray terror of the war, and the way it had felt when the humans came. Not like being rescued. Exactly, but like someone arriving who meant what they said and would stay as long as they needed to, and then go, without asking for anything back. He didn't have words for it in Thalassian. There wasn't really a category for it. But he thought about that shuttle and those 61 scarred ships and the calm voice of a woman saying, "We're all ready. On our way," and the sheer ordinary certainty of a species that had grown up on the most dangerous rock in the galaxy and come out of it somehow impossibly kind, out beyond the edge of the conclave's map space. The human fleet ran in tight formation towards Sol, the small yellow star that no one had thought was important. They had been away for nearly 5 months. Their ships needed proper repair. Their crews needed rest, hot food, real sleep. They were going home. On the bridge of the Endurance, Admiral Algonquian stood at the viewport and looked at the stars. Ahead, her first officer Santos came to stand beside her. They were quiet together for a while. "Think we'll hear from them again?" Santos asked. Akunquo thought about Esival's tired, determined face, about Kethra sitting in the empty station, slowly learning to imagine a different world, about a Thalassian child eating ration pack crackers in the ruins of her own home, without fear. "Yes," she said, "and when we do, we'll go." Santos nodded. He didn't ask anything else. He had known the answer before he asked. The fleet jumped. The stars blurred and vanished, and there was nothing left in that stretch of space but light and silence in the long, quiet aftermath of a war that had ended not with a great final battle, not with one side crushed and the other triumphant, but with two people sitting in two chairs in an empty room, and one of them extending a hand and the other one taking it. It was not the kind of ending that made for dramatic stories, but it was real, and it held, and that was more than enough.